Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Gabrielle Robinson, and we're going to discuss her memoir, which has issues of family secrets and political consequences. Dr. Gabrielle Robinson is a Professor Emeritus who taught English and literature and drama at Indiana University South Bend. She earned her MA in Columbia University and her Ph.D. at the University of London. Dr. Robinson was given the keys to the city of South Bend and won the Sagamore of Wabash, which is Indiana's highest award for contributions to the state. She's written several books on drama, German immigrants to Indiana, and also an account of Black Studebaker workers who struggled against housing segregation. She's always put those personal situations in their historical context. Today we want to discuss her latest book, which was published last year. As I said, it's a memoir, dramatically punctured by her own experience. It's called Oppie's Berlin Diaries, My Quest to Understand My Grandfather's Nazi Past. After finding his diaries and learning he was a member of the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, during World War II, Professor Robinson sought to reconcile her image of love for her grandfather with the recognition of his Nazi past, which raises questions for all of us about how to respond to a discovery of a beloved person's unadmirable past. So welcome, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to talk to you. And yeah, that certainly was the main hurdle to begin with. I happened to find the diaries after my mother's death in her Vienna apartment. And since I'd spent the happiest years of my childhood with my grandfather, I immediately started to read. And I realized that these were daily entries in 1945 in Berlin, in central Berlin, right near the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate and Hitler's bunker, of course.
Well, that must have been exciting to find these diaries.
Yes,
okay.
I thought, oh, what a find, and what a daily testimony of what an ordinary citizen went through, first under the constant day and night bombing and then under Soviet occupation. He worked as doctor, and I read about the horrendous conditions. After they had drained the last drops of water from the heaters, they had no more water in the medical cellars. Light came only from candles, hardly any medications. And he describes the stench and the blood, and the naked dead were simply stacked outside. I mean, just a horrendous situation. So I thought I would transcribe or tell the story of the diaries, in part as a tribute to my grandfather, whom I loved dearly, but also as a record of the times, because historians keep talking more and more about that history isn't just made by the leaders, by the big shots. It's also the experience of everyday citizens that can help us understand the time. So that's how I set out. And then when I came home and read more into the diaries, I kept seeing these two letters, P and G. And at first I read over it because there were all these horrendous details and the smoke and the fires, and I didn't pay. But then suddenly, I will never forget that moment. Suddenly, I was sitting and I realized P and G meant Parteigenosse, which meant party member. And at first I didn't want to believe it, but eventually it really hit me like a punch to the gut almost.
So does he at any point in his diaries explain what party that he's a member of? I mean, does that become clear to you?
Parteigenosse there, what meant to be.
It meant to be
yes.
In the National Socialist Party.
And he was talking eventually later on as the Soviets came in and they were hunting former Nazis. He was one of the hunted. So it became clear to me that he had been a member of the Nazi Party.
So you start reading the diaries and you're excited to get this experience that's connected to your family, but you come upon this revelation. That must be shocking.
Right.
Yes.
In fact, I did exactly what my mother had done. I hid the diaries again. I didn't even tell my husband. I just wanted to forget it. I felt so shocked and so ashamed. I did not want to deal with it. And ironically, what in the end, 2 years later, got me to write was I was working on that book you mentioned, The Better Homes of South Bend, on African-American housing segregation. And as sort of background, I read Slaves in the Family. It's a book by Edward Ball. And he talks about in the introduction how when he told his family that he was going to write about the slaves his grandfather kept, they were up in arms. One of them even shouted at him, "You're going to dig up our grandfather and hang him." They just did not want this. And at first he stopped, like me. You know, he had reservations to go so much against what his family wanted and, you know, the exposure to the shame and so on. But eventually he decided, and that was when it seemed he was speaking to me, he may not be responsible for what his ancestors did, but he is accountable.
What's that distinction?
I think it's a shifty one myself, a bit.
Yeah, because Germany for the war years was a Nazi country. Obviously there were dissenters, but they were dispatched fairly quickly. So you'd have to assume that everybody that has a German ancestor somehow had a connection with the Nazi parties. So I know this is shocking for you personally and for your family.
And for my generation,
but
you know.
It just seems like there's almost an expectation that if I dig deep enough, I'm going to find this out.
Yes, but I did not have that expectation. It never crossed my mind.
Yeah.
It was in part made possible by growing up in the 50s in Germany, and there was this complete silence about the war. You know, I got this excellent education in the gymnasium, that German high school, so good that when I came to the United States as a freshman and studying English literature, I went from freshman to a master's at Columbia in 3 years, just because my education was so good in high school. But our history classes ended with the end of World War I, as if nothing had happened after that. Here we were in the 50s, and the whole Nazi period was simply...
Just leave it out.
Leave it out. They did not want to talk about it. It was only later in the 60s that they realized that they couldn't move ahead as a country unless they fully faced their past.
It seems the inverse of what we have in this country. It's almost like the history of race relations started with Martin Luther King in the 1960s, and anything before that is either subdued or non-existent. So. I mean, the story that you wrote, I don't want to get off on the other book, but the story you wrote about better homes in South Bend is an indication that that was something that existed in this country in the 50s and 60s.
Absolutely.
But that's uncomfortable, to say the least.
But, you know, books like Richard Rostand's The Color of Law and so on are talking, at the end he's talking about how he studied the high school textbooks, current high school textbooks, or school textbooks, and he finds so little reference to what actually happened and what, you know, America did and so on. Certainly not in terms of housing segregation, but even in all
more
other
than
aspects.
that, law and daily life and the rest, yes. You might see some old photographs, but beyond that.
Yeah.
And we did see old photographs of Nazi Germany, right? The United States, particularly with the Marshall Plan, wanted to stress how democratic the U.S. was. And so there was this kind of collective shame.
Right.
And understandably don't want to think about this, don't want to talk about it. But you take this and you write a memoir. You go public, which is more than just working through this as yourself or your family with this information, but you have a memoir. Why write a memoir and then have it published and want people to read it?
I wanted people both to understand how much my grandfather's life had been impacted by, as somebody called it, the volcanic eruptions of the 20th century. He served in the First World War as a doctor, and he served in the Second World War. He lost his only son, he lost his home and his livelihood, and life had, you know, the history of the 20th century just had a huge impact on his life. And I would like them to feel even some kind of empathy and maybe reflect on the impact of history on all our lives and how it has, you know, formed the people we are. And
but when you say that about your grandfather, I mean, that's at a time in German history where the Nazis were a huge party. There were demonstrations, there were rallies, there were, right, beatings of people that didn't agree with them. So, I mean, and I don't know the story, it may not even been understandable in looking at the diaries, but was he intimidated? Was he complacent? Did he not see that he had much choice, or was it because he served in the military the first time, so he had a certain allegiance to the military, and that just kind of led him forward? I mean, this...
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that really is one of the central questions, right? What is German guilt, and what is his particular guilt?
And what is your, as you said before, what is your own responsibility?
Responsibility, right. And in the diary, he, to my amazement, he says very little about that. He will make sort of references saying, my success, and he was one of the best known ophthalmologists in Berlin at the time, my success has never been based on, you know, the misfortune of anybody else, or I've never done anything to hurt anyone. In his mind, I can see he's saying, I'm not really guilty. But there is a political guilt, and that was in a way one thing that I had to also face, because I'm not that politically engaged. And we all act politically, even if we don't do anything. Yeah. Even if we don't vote, it's a political act, right? And there is a responsibility. So to say there was no responsibility for him, I could not say, you know, his denazification document said he was exonerated, but that was not the whole story. But in terms of the individual guilt, what I don't know, for example, is how his daily life was in the 30s and 40s. What kind of small acts of courage or of cowardice did he commit, right?
You couldn't discover that in the diaries.
I could not discover that, but that would, so in a way, his degree of guilt.
I'm an ophthalmologist. I'm going to look at my patient. I'm going to help them recover. I'm going to do what I need to do, and then I'm going to go home.
Exactly.
I may be PG, a member of a party, but that's simply because everybody has to be in order for me to continue my practice to help people. I mean, you can almost think, even though it may not have been written in the diary that way, it suggests that that's a process that probably many people went through just to continue with their daily lives.
And once you were in the party, you couldn't get out, right? That was just, you know, would have sacrificed himself and his family, so he could not get out. But I was also asking myself, what would I have done? You know, say when you walked on in the streets and there was a demonstration or there was some prominent Nazi walking about, it was your duty to give the Hitler salute. Now, would I have walked by and not done that? Or would I have, you know, those are the kind of things that I do not know.
The interesting thing is, and all of your books do this, you take the individual, the participant, and put them in that historical context. So we can't take Gabrielle today, your background and living in this country, and say, oh, I would never have done that, because at that time it would have been a different understanding, a different expectation, almost a different conditioning.
Right.
Even if you didn't want to, you might have done it just because, well, it's no big deal. Or.
And you would be afraid, you know, there were spies everywhere. The Gestapo had these infamous interrogation cellars where they would put people. There was, you know, you could face the death sentence for listening to the BBC, you know, because they, of course, cut off all media and all, there was no news except their own propaganda and lies. So it was, you felt endangered at all times, and he will write about that you couldn't trust anybody, you know. Every house had a kind of supervisor who was checking on everybody, whether they, on Sundays, they had meatless Sundays in order to save money for the war effort, and this person would show up in your apartment to see whether you indeed had a meatless Sunday. So everything was supervised, and every street had its block commander and so on. So you were constantly endangered. So would you have acted or not? You know, and did he? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, it would be. I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine somebody on their own individual compulsion to take that. Whereas, as you said, there might have been demonstrations, there may have been other organizations that fought, the Socialist Party and Jewish groups, and others obviously did, but individuals that had lacked those connections, it would have been you kind of against
Yeah.
the world that you lived in, which is very difficult.
Actually, it just reminds me, there's a sort of interesting term after the war, and I heard it as a child, and I didn't quite know what it was. It's inner emigration. And it's exactly what you just described, keeping your head down, looking after your family, doing your job, and not paying attention to much else. You have emigrated inside yourself.
It sounds a lot like people that work in corporate America today that want a promotion, that they say, keep your head down, it's above my pay grade, I don't want to get into that, I'm just going to do my job, I'm going to take my paycheck.
And move ahead.
Well, the question is, you mentioned it before, and maybe you want to expand on a little bit, the difference between a responsibility for ancestors, guilt for ancestors, and accountability. I'm not sure I understand the differences between accountability and responsibility.
Well, what I thought, and I don't know whether Edward Ball would have thought that, but actually for all of us, we have in some ways profited from the things we've done, right? Slavery has profited a lot of people who weren't slaveholders at all. And my grandfather, being a member of the Nazi Party, may have ensured our survival, right? So there
at least
is
his
some
success as a doctor and the ability to raise his family and educate the offspring and the rest. So it may not be a direct, because I think it's difficult to say some working class white person in Hammond benefited directly from slavery, where I would see the people that own the banks or run the universities or some of the institutions that profited from that. It's more direct, which isn't to say that the society as a whole hasn't been affected by that. But.
Right, and all the cotton the slaves produced and so on, which helped the economy, and it's raised a lot of boats other than the African Americans. And when I again worked on that other book, Martin Luther King said, I think it's a letter from Birmingham jail, and I wish I had the exact quote, but he said something like, we shouldn't only repent the vicious acts of the bad people, but the terrible silence of the good. Mm-hmm. And there it is right there too.
It seems that when you're talking about Oppie, your grandfather, and that story and the accounting of that, it seems to have echoes today. I mean, I would like to think that Germans that lived during World War II want to keep their distance from what had happened, and they don't want any part of it. I guess I would like to think that the people that occupied Congress on January 6th, a few years down the road, would not be so proud of that either. But why did they participate? It seems like there's elements that are not the same by any stretch, but there is elements of a rising nationalism, a rising racism, the rise of misinformation, the media framing of events, all of which contributes to this culture that either keep your head down and just go about your own personal business, leave the big decisions to others, or in worst case scenario, you end up with white supremacist groups that really get agitated about this. So, I don't mean to make connections there that aren't, but I just wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah, the situation in some ways is similar. First of all demagogues and all people who are trying to, break through the democratic limits and so on are the same, right? They all really thrive on the dissatisfaction and the injustice and the anger and the fear of so many people, right? And that was true with Hitler too, of course. World War I had a punishing Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty, where Germany lost a third of its territory, had to pay huge reparations.
There was resentment for that, for things that had been taken away, and you could identify that.
Right, and the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democratic institution, had to sign that. And so people were angry at that. Plus, there were all these, the Communist Party was very strong, especially in Berlin at the time. And the young communists were constantly having demonstrations and fighting and so on. And then there were the young Nazis, So Hitler could make use of all of this and use it to his purpose. What I hope the difference is when you say that the people of January 6th down the road won't be proud of this anymore, is that America has been a century-old democracy with institutions that hopefully will hold up, right? Germany didn't have that. They never had a democracy. Weimar was it, the first one, right, at the end of World War II, at a time of terrible turmoil, where the inflation, where a loaf of bread cost 50,000 marks or more. By the next morning, it would be even more. And, the country was just, and so many people had died, and other people had given their lives for something that now was held to be, evil and wrong, and so on. There was so much dissatisfaction. And Hitler kept talking about how he would bring peace and prosperity and make Germany great again, that Germany would not be the pariah of the world. And that appealed to lots of people.
Well, people that would bear the brunt of that would probably be most responsive to that rhetoric, right? If you've actually, the inflation has eaten your wages, or you've not been able to find work and the rent goes up, and you're going to respond to that. And then if you have a scapegoat, which in the case of Germany was Jews and other immigrants, but largely Jewish people, it has a ring.
Right.
It has some ring of
yes.
Based on your experience,
yes.
which is, I would say, it's not radically different than the white working class that has its wages frozen in this country for more than 60 years.
Absolutely.
But then there's discussions about social equality or racism in the police department, and it finds a hearing, because you can say, well, what about me? I've been discriminated against. I lost my job. I can't work in the plant anymore, and I'm now living on this wage, and nobody's worried about me.
Right.
Like you said, a demagogue can come, but the demagogue can't get a hearing unless those social conditions are such that makes that, it's, if not reasonable, at least attractive.
Yes.
I guess would be the word.
Yes, but don't you think that one hopes that American judiciary system and democratic systems are strong enough to weather this storm? I mean, I like to think so, and that it certainly is different from what Germany was like.
And I think the big part is what you mentioned about Weimar, and although they had a parliament, the Social Democrats and the Nazi Party and other parties were just learning that process, and it was not fully developed. But at the same time, whatever social movement there was that may represent the German population so that they could resist that was nascent or disrupted early on. And
right.
I think that when we come here, it's going to be, to my estimation, it's less about which of the two parties or the Supreme Court, and it's more about the American people finding the means to protect their interests and their rights and not be dissuaded by, xenophobic or extremely nationalist calls or appeals to some race demagoguery, but appeals to democracy and
yes.
our solving this problem.
But, this is really your field too with media and communications. If you are fed a steady diet of lies and propaganda,
it's difficult to get around. Yes.
William Scherer, who the American guy who wrote about Berlin in that period, he had access to international newspapers and everything, and he said even he was affected by this constant propaganda. If you keep hearing just that, you at least become uncertain that you don't know anymore.
If you watch enough superhero movies, you're affected by the stories of the superhero
yes.
movies. I will accept that. We don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to close with, what do you hope comes from the publishing of the book? I mean, I understand why you did it and that, but what do you hope, if you were to say, I want people to read this and then they'll go away understanding?
Yes, I hope, first of all, they'll understand how we have so much more in common than what divides us, and to have empathy with people no matter how different from you they are, because that is, I think, something we really need right now. And then a more personal thing is, as an English professor and writing professor, I love to help other people tell their stories. So if there's somebody out there who doesn't quite know how to get started but would like to tell their family stories or their own stories, please get in touch with me because I'm helping folks all across the country. It's not that I can tell them what to do, but just the conversation sometimes triggers something in them
like
so they can do
the
it.
person that you had put the diaries away for 2 years until you read about the other
Exactly, yes.
stories. So
Yes.
Excellent. So we hope that people understand we're not that different from people that we may appear at first blush to have tremendous differences with.
Absolutely.
And we also should be able to tell our stories. So thank you that. And this is Dr. Gabrielle Robinson. That's all the time we have on our program today. Thank you for joining me on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.